Oracle installation and database creation. In this nugget, we'll discuss the various Oracle editions available to us from their main website, that's oracle.com. There's about 5 different editions available, and in the trial version, all of them are free, but once you use them in a production environment, they have varying costs. Then we'll discuss the installation prerequisites. Now, of course, you will need a machine to run Oracle off of, but in addition to that, you'll need to know how much memory to use and how much disk space you'll need. Then we'll discuss the Oracle Universal Installer. This is otherwise known as the OUI. Okay, this is a graphical or a command line tool that helps you install the software. Now, when you're running this, you do have an option to create a database at the same time. So optionally, you can launch the DBCA, or Database Creation Assistant. Now, that can be run as a wizard, a graphical wizard, or it can be run at the command line with what we call a response file. So this is what is known as a quiet install. Now there's a third way of creating a database, and that is completely from scratch. You can do it manually. If you're one of those people that likes to build everything from scratch just to get the self-satisfaction, hey, you can try this, whatever curls your toes. Okay, so I will show you how to do this. And then the last thing we'll discuss are special considerations for Windows versus Linux and Unix. So here we have our Oracle editions. You can download all of these from Oracle's main website. The first one that I briefly want to mention is the Lite edition. This is used to build, manage, and deploy web applications for mobile devices, such as cell phones and PDAs. Next, we have the Express edition. This is a smaller type of database. You can only have up to 4 gigabytes of data. The machine that it's running on can only be up to 1 gigabyte of memory and running on only 1 CPU. Next, we've got Standard Edition 1. This has to be purchased for 5 users minimum, and it can be up to 2 processor machine. And this has some web application tools in addition to all the things that came with the Express edition. Now, this does cost some money, but you can still download it for free as long as you're not using it in a production environment. Then there's the Standard Edition. It does cost a little bit more than the Standard Edition 1. However, it does support what we call a clustered environment. You might hear the term RAC, which stands for Real Application Clusters. It simply means that we have the ability to have more than one database instance tapping into a database. Now, the last edition that we'll talk about is the Enterprise Edition, which involves Captain Picard and a few Borgs. It goes where no database has gone before. Really, this is just the Cadillac of all the different editions. It has everything the Standard Edition has, plus some really neat features dealing with data guard. That's in case you've got one database going down, another one can pick up where it left off. Also, it has some data mining features as well as some data warehousing tools, analytic processing tools. We've got all sorts of nice bells and whistles that come along with this. One of my favorite features is called flashback, where you can actually flashback a whole database. So it's kind of like pushing the rewind button and saying, okay, I messed up. I want to rewind the whole database 5 minutes ago. Or you can undrop tables, do things like that. You know, another great feature of the Enterprise Edition is the ability to perform rolling upgrades. That just means we can install Oracle patches without having to bounce the database or the server that it's on. You can also perform parallel operations with this edition. That simply means that you can do really intensive queries with more than one process at the same time. So you just have more oomph to your queries. Now, this list of features here is not at all complete, but these are my favorite features of the Enterprise Edition. We can talk more about these extra add-ons in the OCP course. Before you download any Oracle software, you do want to make sure that you have all the right prerequisites on your machine. For example, enough memory, enough disk space, the right OS. And so the way you do that is just open up a browser, go to tahiti.oracle.com like I have up here. To access this website, you will have to register your email address. It is free, however. So just click on the first link for 10G Release 2, and it takes you to the documentation. It's a nice tabular format. We can just go to the first page, scroll down to the quick installation guides, and I'm going to find the documentation for Windows. Okay, so now we're on the main page here. We can scroll down, and it talks about all of the hardware requirements and software requirements. Let's talk about your prerequisites for Oracle installation. Now, if you're running on Linux, you're going to need at least 1024 megabytes of RAM. So the way we find that out is just type in grep memtotal/proc/meminfo. And yes, that is case sensitive. Okay, next we're going to check how much swap space there is. Well, how much swap space you need really depends on how much RAM you've got. So here I've included a nice little chart on the side. If you have under 1024 megabytes of RAM, you're going to need twice as much swap space. So in other words, if we've got 1,000 megabytes of RAM, you're going to need 2,000 megabytes of swap. Then we have other categories here. For example, if you've got over 8192 megabytes of RAM, then you will only need 0.75 times that amount of swap space. Okay, so we use the grep command to find out how much swap space. Grep swap total/proc/meminfo. Next, you're going to need 400 megabytes of disk space in your /temp directory. The way we can find that is just do a df-k. You can actually be in any directory. Make sure you do this as root. Then you want to also make sure you've got between 1.5 to 3.5 gigabytes of disk space, as well as 1.2 gigabytes of disk space for the database. So this value up here is just for the Oracle software. And of course you want to make sure that you've got the right processor type. In other words, you want to make sure that it's actually supported by Oracle. So just grep model name/proc/CPU info, see what your output is, and then go to the documentation that I showed you on tahiti.oracle.com. Make sure it's one of those supported platforms. Additional items you need to be aware of on Linux and Unix are creating the proper users and groups. So you need to make sure that you have an Oracle user. This is the user that's going to own all the data files. And you also need to have a user called nobody. And that's used in conjunction with the HTTP daemon for Enterprise Manager. You also need to create the groups DBA and OInstall. Anyone who belongs to the DBA group then has sys privileges on the database. The OInstall is used for the Oracle Universal Installer. Okay, so also you need to make sure that you have the proper kernel parameters. So you would look at the documentation and then make sure that you have the proper parameters mentioned in the docs by logging in as root and then typing in sysctl-a. Now, if you find that your parameters aren't correct, then you'll need to modify them. So you'll go into the etc syscontrol-conf file, make your modifications, and then type in sysctl-p to make your changes stick. Then, of course, you need to make sure that you have the proper environment variables set. You must have the Oracle SID and the Oracle Home set. On Windows, you can get away with your Oracle Home not being set, but on Unix and Linux, it must be set. Okay, and then you will run the installer to launch the OUI. So when I make references in this demonstration of the setup program, well, if you're running on Unix or Linux, make sure you say run installer instead. On Windows, you're going to need at least 256 megabytes of RAM. 512 is actually recommended. Take that recommendation seriously. I've had Oracle on Windows take my machine down to a screeching halt. As far as virtual memory, you'll need double whatever your RAM is. For your disk space, have at least 2.04 gigabytes just for the Oracle software, and then of course you'll need space for your data. You'll need 550 megahertz processor minimum. Most likely you have a faster machine than that anyway. And you need to, of course, be able to display at least 256 colors. So, how do you find out that information on Windows? Well, let's go to our control panel by clicking Start, Settings, Control Panel. And you'll see the System icon. Go ahead and double-click on that. And here's most of our information. We've got 2.2 gigahertz machine, 512 megabytes RAM. That looks good so far. Let's find out about our virtual memory. So you go to your Advanced tab. Under Performance, click on Settings, and then under Advanced there, this is where you'll find out the virtual memory. So I've got 768 megabytes. Now that's not double what my RAM is. But since I am the only person on this machine and I really don't have anything else running on it right now, I should be okay just to show you. But do keep those recommendations. Make sure your virtual memory is double your RAM. Now, to find out how much disk space we have, I'm going to hit my Windows and then the E key. That's a shortcut to bring up my Windows Explorer. Okay, so I want to find out how much space I have on my C drive. So I'll right-click on that and click on Properties. And I've got about 119 gigabytes of free space. That should be enough. So now that you know you've met all your prerequisites, let's go ahead and install the Oracle software. And here we are at Oracle's website. Now what we're going to do is go ahead and download their software. If you scroll to the right, you'll see a link that says Downloads. Go ahead and click on that. We're going to download and install the Windows version, and then later we'll talk about the differences between Windows and Linux and Unix. Okay, so click on Oracle Database 10G Enterprise Standard Editions. And it takes you to this page. Make sure you download the proper version for Microsoft Windows. And then you're taken to the acceptance page. It looks like they've got all the evildoers covered. Make sure you read all the details, hit the accept button, and you're good to go. So just take a few minutes to download the 655 megabyte file. I went ahead and downloaded my file to my desktop. So the next thing you want to do is extract it. You can use something like WinZip or Zip Central, or you can even use the Java tool called jar if you're familiar with that. I'm going to go ahead and double click on mine. I extracted my zip file to the C drive, which gave me the database directory here. Underneath that, we've got our install directory. And underneath there, we've got OUI.exe. So we just go ahead and double click on that. And it gives us a nice little splash page. And there we go. So we go ahead and click Next. Let's just install the standard edition and hit Next. And we can leave almost everything just as the defaults, or a DB10G Home 2. If you want to change the directory path, that's fine, but leaving it like it is fine too. Go ahead and hit Next. Well, eventually you get to a screen that looks like this. You have several choices: create a database, configure what we call ASM, we'll talk about that later, or install database software only. Let's go ahead and just install the software. Hit Next. And this gives you a brief synopsis of all the things you're installing and how much space is required. Big long list here. Go ahead and hit Install. After you install your Oracle software, then you'll want to install the database. Now you can launch the Database Creation Assistant either from the OUI or from the command line here. So I'm going to launch it with DBCA from the command line, and we'll get a nice little splash page and get to the wizard. Now the wizard's pretty easy to step through. In fact, for most cases, you can just hit next, 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 finished, and you're done, like a lot of Windows applications, right? Okay, so go ahead and hit Next. We want to create a database. Later I'll show you how to manage templates. It's just a way of storing the meta information about your database. And then we'll talk a little bit later about automatic storage management. That has to do with logical disk volumes. Okay, so we want to create a general purpose database. You have other choices here, and really the way in which these differ are the initialization parameters. Okay, so general purpose should be just fine. If you want to see the details of what your initialization parameters look like, just click on the details. And these are the different options, and here are your initialization parameters. Now by the end of this course, you should understand what most of these mean. Okay, good. Close that. Go on to the next page. Now, we need to have a distinct name for our database. That's the global database name. So I'm going to choose the name ORCL dot and then my domain name. On Windows, this is the name of your computer. Well, the name of my computer is Johnson. I can also put localhost as long as you can go to a DOS prompt and perform a ping on your server name, then that is the server name you need to use. Okay, so ORCL is the unique identifier for the instance. You can have several instances on one machine. Okay, in this course, we're just going to have one instance on each machine. Okay, so now hit next. And yes, we want to configure our database with Enterprise Manager, which is a wonderful, wonderful GUI-based tool. It's actually browser-based, and it lets you do things like add files, move things around. It lets you do all sorts of configuration management. We're not going to mess with email notifications or daily backup quite yet. We're going to have 4 built-in user accounts: sys, system, dbsnmp, and sysman. Sys and system are the most frequently used. Let's just go ahead and create the same password for all of these accounts. If you wanted to make them separate, then you choose the second radio button. So on to the next page. So how would you like your files stored? Would you like them on a file system? Would you like to use ASM? That's new to 10G. That's basically using logical disk volumes. Or do you want to use raw devices such as tape? Well, let's just stick with file system and go on to the next page. Now, the location of your data files. You can have them be at the default location specified from our template, or you can specify your own location. You can browse to that directory, or you can use what we call OMF, Oracle Managed Files. This is a simplified way of managing your data files. They have specific naming conventions, and what's nice about OMF is that when you delete data files on the database level, it actually deletes them on the OS level as well. I'm going to stick with data files from our template, and we'll hit next. Okay, now remember earlier I was talking about flash recovery, where you can rewind the database to a particular point in time. Well, if you want to enable this feature, which I highly recommend, then click on Specify Flash Recovery Area. Now, you also need to enable archiving, so click on that as well. We're going to keep all the archive mode parameters at their default values for right now, and I'll show you later how to modify those. And to the next page. So there's several schemas that you can install, and these are the sample schemas. For example, you might hear of the schema called Scott with the password of Tiger. You're going to see lots and lots of examples in Oracle's documentation regarding Scott. It's always nice to have these. So go ahead and click on that and hit Next. Now, you'll always get this warning. Hit OK, and we have a review of our memory, our sizing, character sets, connection mode. We'll discuss dedicated versus shared server mode later. But basically, if you want to tweak any of these now or later, you can do that. Okay, so we hit Next, and we are finished. So go ahead and click on Finish. Now, if you get a warning like this, saying, hey, these files are going to be overwritten, it simply means that you previously had a database that were using these data files, and they're going to be clobbered. And yes, I do want to go ahead and continue because I want to clobber those. So here's a review page of our database that's about to be created. And then we can just hit OK. And it's in the process of creation. This might take up to 20 minutes. When you're finished with the database creation part, you should be able to open up a browser and point it to your domain name, :5560/iSQL+, and get this iSQL+ splash screen. All right, now you've created your database. Now, if you go to a DOS prompt and echo out the Oracle SID, you should see your SID right there. Now remember how I said you can have several databases on one machine, several instances on one machine. So if that was the case and you wanted to launch SQL+ to get into a particular database, you would first of all set the SID and then launch SQL+. What I'm about to show you is really cool. Remember earlier I mentioned those response files where we can do a quiet install? Well, I'm about to show you that. So let's say you have to create 20 databases and they all have really similar configuration parameters. Well, what you can do is, first of all, walk through that GUI once and record all the information that you're setting up in a response file. So the way we do that is we type in setup. We use the option record. We're recording all of our responses. And then the destination file. This is the name of the file that is our response file. You really can put it in any location. Now be aware that we're launching this from our database directory. That's the place where we extracted the zip file. Okay, so it launched this little window here, and then you're taken to the wizard. Make sure that your Oracle home is a value that you don't already have set. In other words, if your Oracle home is db_1, make sure this is a different value. Okay, I'm going to make sure this says standard edition just so it doesn't take as long. And also make sure the global database name is different from your previous global database name because that is the unique identifier. So remember, my domain was Johnson. And then I'll put in my passwords. And I'm not telling you what my passwords are. And if we wanted to, we could make this an advanced installation, but we'll just keep it basic. Okay, hit next. And this does take a moment. Beautiful. We're taken to this nice page. It tells us that we've passed the test, so we can continue on. And hit next. Now, when you get to the summary page, do not hit install. This is the part where I tell you not to hit the button and you go ahead and hit the button, right? No, don't hit the install button. Hit cancel. Do I really want to exit? Of course I do. That's why I pushed the button. Now, let's see what's in our directory. Here we go. We've got basic.rsp. That is the response file that was created. We did not create a database yet. This file is what we're going to feed to our installer. Let's go ahead and run the silent installation. Make sure you're in your database directory. We have an executable called setup. We feed in the option of silent. We say response file and then the full path of that response file. Even if it's in the current directory, you must put that full path. Okay, so let's hit enter and we get a new window. And it will tell us here in a second where the log file is going to go. There we go. Okay, we can find it under Program Files, Oracle Inventory, and so on. So all this stuff will splash across the screen, and it looks like everything is passing. So far, so good. And this process might take up to 20 minutes. Really depends on how large your data files are. And there's one more way of creating a database, and that's by Scratch. Now, if you're on Windows, the first thing you're going to have to do is create an Oracle service. The way we do that is with the oradim utility. You can launch this from any directory. Say oradim-new -sid and then the SID name. Instance created. Great. Then you'll create an initialization file that has parameters for your database. You'll have to have a DB name. So our database name here is test. The instance name. This instance name will almost always be like the database name, unless, of course, you're in a clustered environment where you've got multiple instances tapping into one database. Then you specify one or more control files. These are used when the database is in the mount mode. We'll talk about the various modes of the database a little later. You also need to specify your background and user dump directories. These are used for trace files on the Oracle database level and also on the session level, individual level. Specify your DB max files, 1000, then some undo parameters. We'll talk about those in a later nugget. And then the shared pool size. I've specified this to be 75 megabytes. Shared pool is just used to store SQL statements. We want to go back to our prompt and launch SQL+. So SQL+ / as sysdba. We're logging on as the OS user. So the slash means we're not using a username and password. We're logging on rather as an authenticated user on the OS level. Okay, so connected to an idle instance means that we're connected to the database, but the database is down right now. Then we want to start the Oracle instance. The instance is just the collection of background processes and memory structures used to tap into a database. So when we say start up no mount, that simply means that we're starting the instance, but the database is not open. P file is the parameter file. We give the full path to where our parameter file is. Okay, so this is a good sign. All this stuff that came back means that We've got some memory structures in place. And I'm going to select status from $V instance, and it says that our database is started. Great. Okay, the next step, we're going to have a little script that creates our database. Okay, so this dash dash just means it's a comment. Here's our main script, create database test. Test is the name of our database that we specified in the initialization file. Max log files 32. Okay, we'll talk about what log files are later, but that's what the maximum number is. Max data files 500. Then we have a data file. You give the full path of where your system tablespace file is going to go. More on system tablespace later. We do need to specify the size, in this case 325 megabytes, and the reuse clause just means that if that file already exists on the OS level, go ahead and clobber it, overwrite it. Okay, so on 10G we have a new tablespace called sysocs, so we have to specify the specifications for that too. Okay, the size and the location. Don't worry too much about the auto extend clause. You need to know more about the internals of the database before we get into those details. You do have to specify your character set, and then last you specify your log files. Log files are where all the changes to the database are going to be made. I made sure earlier that I launched SQL Plus from the same directory where that create script is sitting. Okay, so that way I don't have to specify the full path when I launch it. I can just say @create. And this might take a few seconds. And eventually you should get this database created. So great. Let's do a select status from $V instance again. See what the status is. Our database is open. Let's go ahead and wrap up this nugget. We did talk about our Oracle editions. Most likely you will be using either the Lite edition or Standard. Make sure you get that from Oracle's website. And then of course also look at the documentation for the installation prerequisites. We also discussed our Oracle Universal Installer. Use it as you like, either as a graphical tool or a command line tool. Same with your DBCA. It just depends on which way you like it, using wizards or through response files or manually. And of course we talked about our special considerations for Windows, Linux, and Unix. Remember in Windows, the Oridim utility, that's really important. If you don't use that, it will not work. And also for Linux and Unix, make sure that you create those Oracle users and O-install groups like we talked about. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.